This is my second video in my series on invest in the coming disruption of the economic world order. As I was deciding about how I was going to approach this second video, I was reminded of a painting that I did a number of years ago. Actually, it's a copy of a Salvador Dali painting. I went through a period of my life when I needed something to create, and I got into art. You might have noticed the Picasso over here. I also painted that, and I'll get into more about that sometime later. But this painting was done in 1943 by Salvador Dali, and it depicts the birth of the United States from an egg, if you will, looked on by a third world woman and her daughter, and it depicts the emergence of the United States as a world power as they entered into World War II, and this is Dali's interpretation. I was reminded of it because on July 1st, 1944, 730 delegates from around the world met at Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to create the New World Order. The war was coming down to an end, and there was just a general agreement that something had to be put together to make sure that something like Hitler in Germany did not happen again. And these 730 delegates got together to form what is now the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the International Bank for the Restoration and Development. And what it worked out to be was the free trade global economic system that we know today. Why this is important, I think, to revisit at this time is I think it's apparent if you watched my prior video of the demographic changes in the countries around the world, that this world order is in the midst of change. And what that means to you, if you're involved in any form of investment, the investment community is going to change dramatically as this world order changes, and you need to understand it as it's evolving. It is already evolving, and it probably sped up dramatically with the election of President Trump and his mantra of we're going to make America great again. And what that is being translated into is the tariffs that we're now seeing levied against various countries to change that world order. Part of what is referred to as the Bretton Woods Agreement, the United States basically had the only navy that was left, other than a partially destroyed England, Britain's navy. So there was agreed that there would be an open trade policy. There'd be no tariffs, and there'd be no restrictions. Europe had a manufacturing system, but they didn't have a readily viable market and a readily affordable market. So America was the only continent that had not been, the only Western world country that had not been devastated by the war. America was then a ready and willing buyer of all the Axis powers' goods, and that extended beyond the Axis powers in very short order. America, again, because it had the only viable navy, agreed to protect the seas and keep the seas open for open trade. And that has gone on for 40, 50 years now. The fact that came along with this is the enormous U.S. trade deficit that came along with this agreement. But it has established the means by which the United States could prosper, as could many other countries. Now, as my prior video said, because of demographic changes, a lot of pressures are coming back on the United States that are saying we need to rethink. The overwhelming growth in the U.S. economy and the economies around the world have been once again driven by demographics, and that was the baby boomers. Now, the United States had a much greater impact of the baby boomers, but it was felt throughout Europe as well, as the young generation matured, became workers, then became high wage earners, and started investing capital. Capital was never invested like it is today. A very small part of the population invested until the baby boomers started investing in their 401ks and their IRAs, saving for retirement. That created an immense amount of capital, and that was not only in the United States, but in Europe and eventually in Asian countries as well. This because there was so much capital to invest in corporations, the price of capital came way down, as we are witnessing right now. Interest rates are at historic lows. So with that demand to invest and the price of capital down, the growth was enormous. You only need to look at charts of companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook, the real benefactors of the baby boomers' investments, to see how this cheap capital, technology, and the retirement or the savings of the boomers just drove our economy immensely. We did run into a bump in '08 called the subprime crisis, or in some refer to it as the real estate crisis, but the countries and the world grew exponentially. It was so dynamic, this growth, that some countries that were in destitute poverty, such as Bulgaria, Romania, and China, were able to latch on to this growth and become capital rich and become, in China's case, a real challenger for world dominance. In the coming years of 2020 to 24 is a total change in the world economic situation, because some countries are going to become financially distressed because of a lack of that 20-year-old to 40-year-old consumer. This will create a tightening of capital and an end of the free trade economy that we know today. The question now becomes, will the United States pull back? And the evidence is saying yes. We're seeing some evidence of that with the tariffs that are being implemented and forced on countries all the way from Canada to Mexico to China and to other countries, that we just don't really need their input anymore. I then ask, will we also pull back our support and our security that we have offered these nations over the past at free of charge? Will our Navy come back to port and not be the protector of overseas? Looking at the European continent, we see that countries like England, France, Italy, Germany are dependent upon oil from countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Russia. And in return, those countries with the oil are dependent on food from those who they are selling their oil to. So that makes a good trade balance. But what if oil no longer is important? What if England and France, Italy don't need these other countries' oil? How do they feed their citizens? I'm not sure. Does that mean that we go back into, you have what I want, so I'm going to come take it from you? I don't know. But I think this needs to be thought about as we think about the disruption of the economic world order. So let's get a picture more closely of who the exporters are and who the importers are. This chart shows us who the exporters and who the importers are. Exports are in the red. As you can see, if we start on the far left, Poland exports somewhere in the neighborhood of 45% of everything they make, and they import about 35%. So what that's basically saying is they don't have a consumer base to buy what they make. And as you go down, it gets worse in Korea, and a very balanced and favorable is the United Kingdom. But most countries are exporting most of a substantial amount of what they make, meaning they don't have the population base to consume their products. Now on the far right, you find the United States, and you can see we export somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7% of what we manufacture, and we import somewhere in the neighborhood of 12%, a much more balanced. And that is because of the charts I showed you in the prior video, that we are demographically balanced, closer to balanced. What this means to the countries who don't have that consuming base of 20 to 40-year-olds, that their future is in the hands of the purchasing public in other countries, or better said, in the trade policies of the other countries. And granted, the United States is in an excellent position, and they have a population of about, we have a population of about 300 million, but we also need to recognize that China, who does a tremendous amount of exporting, has a population of 1.3 billion people, roughly 4.5 times the population of the United States. So do I think that China will not always, we will always want to trade with China? Yes, I really do. But I'm going to show you here in a second why China has some other problems that is going to make it very difficult for them to come to the trading table with any real power. This is a chart showing the United States national debt. As you can see, in 2000, it was in the neighborhood of somewhere around $12 trillion. It then climbed, as a result of the subprime crisis, up to 25 trillion, and then has through 2017 moved up to about 28 trillion. That's a lot of money, and it's a lot of debt. But let's put it into perspective. Now we're comparing with that of the European nations. And as you can see, the capital shortage in the European nations was even with ours, or relatively speaking, even with ours, but has surpassed ours as we have moved into the 27. Now we've added Greece, that's the red dotted line, and you can see, and you can probably remember, when Greece got close to bankruptcy back in the teens, and has brought some control with some pressure from the Eurozone. The green line is then Brazil. Brazil has basically imploded. If you watch their political structure, you know one of their candidates was running for president from incarceration. India is the brown line, and you can see how India's debt and capital shortages and that translates to debt, has escalated rapidly. So India, in essence, has financed the growth that they've experienced over the last 2 decades by borrowing money. The blue line is then Turkey. Turkey is in a bad state. This is the upper half of the graph that takes in China's indebtedness. As you can see, they're way out of control. What is this all about? Well, my wife and I were in China probably about 12 years ago. As we drove around, we spent a month in China and we toured basically the whole country. As we got out into the hinterlands, we saw massive construction. Our coach traveled on 4-lane highways basically throughout the country where there was no civilization. What civilization there was farmers raising rice. We were unable to travel in the right-hand lane of the 4-lane highways because this was harvest season of rice in China. And the Chinese farmers took their rice out of the fields where it was wet and laid it on the pavement in the right-hand lane so that it would dry. And the bus drivers and all the few cars that were there obliged by not getting in that lane and allowing their rice to dry. As we left Urumqi, which if you go to a map you will find in the far northwestern corner of China, again traveling on highways, we would see massive developments of maybe 4 towers of 20-story apartment buildings with no one living in them. We would see shopping centers built with no shops in them, whole villages built with no residents. What China basically decided to do when they recognized that the world was full of cheap capital and consumers wanting cheap products, they made the decision that they were going to build the factories for the world and become the shopping center for the world. So before they had the orders for the goods, they were building the factories and then building the housing for the factories, betting that this huge investment, leveraged as you see it in this chart, was going to pay off. Well, the problem is what they didn't recognize, what I taught you in the last video, that the demographics of the world were about to change as the baby boomers aged and took their capital out of the investment markets and moved it into treasuries, which, as I told you, will start happening in 2020 through 24, that a lot of this buying was going to come to a halt. China finds itself now way over leveraged and in a position of no return. We're seeing the first disruptions of this in Hong Kong. There has been a disruption on the other side of the country in Tibet for years. After spending a month in China, I recognize that they have a situation of an East Coast that is the vibrant part of their country. They took billions and billions and trillions of dollars and spent it out in the hinterland building the factories that were going to make anything and everything that we needed from now to forever. And they saw themselves as the future dominant power in the world. And this might have all continued quite well until Donald Trump became president of the United States and said, we're going to make America great again, and we're going to make this a fair game again. What that means, I can only guess. Donald Trump has openly said he wants to move manufacturing back into the United States. Well, how is he going to do that? What's going to make that possible? Well, one of the first and most important things is robotics. That a robot is a much less expensive way to build a pair of Nike shoes than a Chinese and then ship it across the ocean on a freighter and pay whatever tariffs. So robotics will make a difference. The next thing that's going to make a difference in every part of manufacturing is 3D printing. If you can now cut down the number of parts that have to be made to go into an electric automobile, and you do it with 3D printing, your manufacturing costs come down dramatically. We have a wonderful partner south of us who has a perfect demographic chart in Mexico. And we have excellent relationships with Mexico. In fact, just today, it was announced that we entered into a new trade treaty with Canada and Mexico for the future. One of the parts of that treaty said that from now on, if Canada wants to ship automobiles into the United States or Mexico wants to, that 75% of the parts that go into those automobiles have to be made in the United States. Now, a lot of people don't like what Donald is doing, but my point, and I don't like a lot of what Donald is doing, but he's a businessman, and he's disrupting the world order. The next very important part of this is the discovery of shale. Oil that is held under our ground, and we now have the technology to get it out of the ground. I want you to look at this chart. This chart was made relative to the cost and production of oil in the world in 2012. On the far left, you'll see the blue line. That is U.S. shale. As you can see, it's a quantity, but it's by the width of the bar, but it does not hold any amount to the OPEC nations and the Saudi Arabians. And the height of it is the cost of what it takes to get a barrel of it out of the ground. So shale was costing in 2012 $90 per barrel to get it out of the ground, while in Saudi Arabia, crude oil was costing somewhere in the neighborhood of 45, and Saudi Arabia was down around 39. So shale was not a real player at that time, but some things have changed over the last 7 years. Take a look at this. Notice how the blue line has moved down and it's gotten broader. It's now down to somewhere around $35 a barrel, as opposed to the OPEC nations are at 40 and Saudi Arabia is down around 30. What's significant about this is that we no longer need anybody else's oil. And based on current consumption rates, we won't need their oil for 50 years. It's my prediction that when we reach that 50-year mark, we'll actually have many more years because we will have moved to more and more electric automobiles, and our need for oil will have decreased substantially. Again, reflect back to what I told you. When these OPEC nations and Saudi Arabia and Russia lose the revenues from the lack of consumption of oil, they don't have any money to buy food. That is going to cause disruption. That is going to cause war. We'll talk about that in the next video. We're also going to talk in the next video about how these two things are going to force some manufacturing by demand out of countries and back into the United States that we had lost in the past. Next area that is really perplexing on this is if the United States pulls back and says, we don't need what you've got, we're self-sufficient, and we don't need to be spending all this money anymore protecting the seas, what's going to happen? And how are those who are going to be left without their prior protector going to fare? Take a look at this. What you see there are two ships. One is what is called a jump carrier. That's the smaller one. There are about 20 of these in the world. The United States owns 10 of them. What you see next to it is a super carrier. A supercarrier has about a 7-to-1 power ratio over a jump carrier. That is to say, it would take 7 jump carriers, which is almost all that we don't own, to equal the power and the force of a supercarrier. We own all 11 of the supercarriers. They used to tour the oceans of the world to make sure that shipping and that everybody behaved well. It's my understanding that 10 of them are now in port. There's one that is out near the Persian Gulf. We're already pulling back. The question is, will we maintain that role? Will we charge for that role? Or will other countries attempt to replace us at that role? I don't know. I don't know a lot about this. I'm not that smart. It's above my pay grade. But what I do know is there is a changing world order. And if you are an investor, if you're a businessman, an entrepreneur, if you're a real estate agent, you need to be aware of these things, because unlike the past, where this will take decades to play out, we're talking about 3 to 5 years. Things are moving so fast. I did a video on quantum computing. I want to talk a little bit more about that because I see so many options and so many opportunities for intelligent people. And I see so many ways that this is going to change the world. And when you couple these two things together, and you're a genius in a country that has a heads up on in technology, and I'm speaking of China, and you see the country coming apart from the seams, where do you want to go? Where do you want to take your talents? I really believe within 10 years, China will be numerous regions. There will be numerous states. It will be a replay of the Soviet Union breaking up. If you're an investor, you need to be watching and paying attention to these things. So I'm going to, because it excites me. It helps me. I'm not painting anymore. So I need to create in another way. And I love creating videos, and I love sharing them with you. So subscribe, like the video, and ring the bell so you know when I'm putting out my next one. I'm going to continue to try to tie my thumbnails to my love of art. So let me know what you think of that. Let me know what you think of this video, and we'll talk again soon.